I thought I'd open by asking all of you, what does it mean, do you think, for an academic or a student to support or implement BDS in a university? What kinds of things do you think should an academic or student or university in Australia be seeking to do?
I think a primary purpose of our activities in the BDS campaign on university campuses has still got to be, as Stuart Rees was saying in a panel earlier, an initiative in education, educating people about the extent of complicity of our institutions with Israeli higher education and some of the hidden and not so hidden agendas behind that. So as to address an issue which I think a lot of speakers have raised today, which is that in joining the boycott, we're not taking action from a kind of tabula rasa. We're actually altering the mode of our interaction with these issues because we are always already complicit in the occupation simply by sitting here within the walls of this institution. You know, there are connections between the kind of sandstone facings that surround us and the wall illustrated in the conference logo, which we had up on the screen earlier. So that, I think, is one of our primary purposes. And a lot of call to prayer going on. A lot of it's very important to hear Muslim voices. A lot of the kind of interweaving of activity which embeds relations with the occupation in so many layers of our own society goes on behind the scenes and indeed seeks out secret and unaccountable spaces. And in many senses, the decision-making structures of the corporatized university are a secret and unaccountable space, not the least in this institution, which a couple of years ago abolished its 160-year-old majority of elected members on its governing Senate in order to become less accountable. So it's not entirely surprising that this is a space in which you know, these kind of links with the occupation will seek out and try to thrive. One example of that, which burst out into the open a few years ago, was a so-called Israel Research Day that was being put on here by the Office of the Deputy Vice Chancellor International, one of the panoply of senior managers set above us. And it was an entirely, as you would expect, entirely bogus event. It had no possible legitimacy or viability as a scholarly occasion because the topic of discussion would kind of, according to the agenda, would flutter from one unrelated subject to the next, just kind of touching here and touching there. So it's a classic example of an activity which poses as a bona fide research activity, but is in fact aimed at legitimizing and embedding ties with the occupation and making us further complicit in it. And I remember speaking to a few of the colleagues who were taking part from the University of Sydney side, and I think the predominant emotion among them was one of astonishment that this pesky chap from Peace and Conflict Studies was on the phone, urging them to kind of think again about their participation, because they'd taken it for granted that it would just go through on the nod. And disrupting that sense that it will just go through on the nod, I think is the first thing we can do. We can, to use that dreadful academic word, problematize the hegemony. There's a slogan for a placard, if ever there was one. And draw attention to the routine and make it clear to people what the implications of that are in terms of our own complicity with the occupation. So that's the first priority, I think.
I agree with the points you made, and I just would like to add a couple of things. In this context, I think I speak both as a feminist scholar, as a Middle East scholar. And the ideas of two intellectuals inspire me tonight in this discussion. One is Sarah Ahmed. She's a feminist philosopher. And she said, the quote is not exact, I remember it, I remember the content. But if you talk about the problem, you become the problem. And she made this point when she was denouncing sexual harassment on campus in the institution she was working with. And I think that with BDS and with Palestine more in general, this is something that can happen, and this is something that we need to take into consideration when we take a position about that. On the other side, Hannah Arendt reminds us that there are not dangerous thoughts because the same fact of thinking is dangerous. And the question that I'm asking myself more and more is if universities today are the space for critical thinking and for developing dangerous ideas and dangerous thoughts. When I decided that I wanted to be an academic, it was because I wanted to exercise the privilege of critical thinking. And I thought this would have been a job. So what is better than that? Now that I work in the institution, I realize that this is not always the case, which does not mean that you don't have space to exercise and to teach critical thinking. But you need to conquer it, and you need to stand for it. It does not come for granted. So this applies to BDS, but this applies to everything we do in this space. So I don't expect all my colleagues to endorse BDS or to support BDS. What I would expect by academics is to be open to a discussion about BDS. And this is not the case always. We have to promote, even in scholarly associations, we have to promote motions to open spaces for the discussion about BDS. This happened in the Middle East Studies Association of America, and there was a big debate about that in the meeting of 2014. I was there. This happened at Sesamo, the Society for Italian Middle East Studies, in 2016. We had to pass a motion to open a space to discuss about BDS. And I think this should raise some questions, no? And this should be discussed more broadly. As a Middle East Studies scholar, I realize that when we try to bring the discussion about Middle East politics beyond our classes, in spaces of public outreach, we have to face a lot of prejudices and a lot of, the long wave of what was called Orientalism, and which is still there. And this is also problematic. We need to find, in this room we are talking to converted people. We all say we are all like-minded and we all share the same vision, and it's relatively easy to agree on what we are saying. It becomes more difficult when we go beyond this space and we try to talk to also, especially to intellectuals who don't share our same experience about what is the Middle East, what is the Arab world. They associate everything to Islam, to conflict, to terrorism. There are a lot of prejudices and a lot of stereotypes. Not on, especially among intellectuals, and these are very difficult to deconstruct. So this has to do, this has implications about the debate about BDS, and I think this should be addressed in some way.
Yeah, I think I agree with both those comments. I mean, universities are a site of ideological production. That's where ideas are created and disseminated, refined, changed, evolved, generally to the negative, despite what is said. And so being a supporter of social justice, contesting that production and dissemination of ideas is important. And I think especially so because you're dealing with young people who go on and live lives and shape society. And so I think that's one of the positives of being at university and organising both as academics and as students, is that you're hopefully shaping, or at least minimising the shaping of discourse to the negative, or hopefully making it even positive. One of the dangers, though, I think, of organising at a university is to become cloistered and forget the broader community and to lose touch of the broader discussion and the broader need for action. And I guess I think that's an important thing to keep in mind of, because the university, again, does provide outlets for intellectual niches and can do so. But ultimately, what has always changed history, and something that a comrade, Paul McAlee, the head of the MUA in New South Wales, said this morning at a union meeting, the only thing that's ever changed history is people power, is people getting on the streets and defying laws and defying injustice. So being able to link the intellectual discussions on campus to activism, both on and off campus, is something that I think is very important as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, there's always been a space of tension in my political tendencies in relation to my academic tendencies. I don't somehow believe that the two go necessarily easily together. I think there is definitely something unpleasant, in my view. That's my kind of liking when I read an academic text, which is totally subservient to a politics, for instance. I like to think that academia has its own specificity, that it adds something specific to processes in the world. And so I like a politics which tries to maintain the specificity. I think activists do a great job, politicians, well, maybe not. But I don't feel that my job as an intellectual, as an academic, is simply to do more of what activists do, and what I think they do a great job. But I want to add something different. There are questions that academics ask which activists, not because they lack critical inquiry or anything, but if you are into politics, there is a point where you have to stop thinking. You know, it's like you can't be constantly reflecting on what you're doing because academics can. It's a luxury. It's a luxury, and to be constantly reflecting and criticizing what you are doing, and in the end, you can end up not doing anything, which is very much an academic luxury. Now, someone into politics cannot afford to do this. You know, comes the point where you say, okay, I have to take a stand. And to me, precisely, an academic is the person who, when the activist politician takes a stand, the academic is the pain in the ass who comes and says, no, I want to keep on asking questions. And so that moment is a moment of tension between the political and the academic. And I don't believe this moment of tension can be easily reconciled. It's a moment as an academic which you inhabit. You inhabit and squeeze whatever you can out of that tension. But you don't think of transcending it. It would be false. You know, as an anthropologist, personally, I'm constantly faced teaching students things, for instance, where, of course, we think of some critical anthropology as critical. It means sometimes you say if you are questioning colonialism and someone says, we are doing it in the name of empowerment. And I can say, okay, well, what makes empowerment so great? And probably an activist, not necessarily, I don't want to stereotype, but on the whole, an activist will look at me and say, piss off. You know? I mean, really, do you want to question whether empowerment is great or not? I mean, come on, empowerment is fantastic. I'm not, so are you going to support non-empowerment? But at the same time, I want that space where I want to think. I mean, who has decided that empowerment and being powerful is so great? is empowerment a Western value? You know, people do this a lot with indigenous people. Where they assume that indigenous people have some kind of like sovereign land possession, mode of existence, and that colonialism came and undermined their sovereignty, and they are responding by saying, I want my sovereignty back. And kind of like easy way of thinking that everybody thinks the same. And we know that when we say this, that there's always the danger of a right-winger coming saying, see, right, indigenous people didn't think sovereign way, so like it's all fine or what have you. So it's not easy. But the thing is critical thinking is not necessarily radical thinking. And I don't think the two necessarily go together. So often they do, but I don't think we want to take it for granted that they go together. And so activism within academia is not easy. I don't believe it is facile to just say, sort of like, I'm for so X, Y, Z, and therefore, as an academic, I can pursue it. You can, someone who is dear to me academically, Pierre Bourdieu, once called, good politics does not necessarily lead to good social science. And that is very true, because the world of academia is full of really good anti-colonialists, anti-racists, etc., who are responding to really conservative thinkers. And in my view, not all of them are as academically enlightening, etc., just because they are anti-racist or anti-colonial. From an academic point of view, many instances prefer to read a conservative thinker, and I think they are much more enriching to read. So there's no equation between them. There's another thing. Another thing is that boycott is not an academic value. An academic value. Boycott is not an academic value. Now, what's interesting about that is, to the extent that academia has a culture, it is a culture of interaction. It is a culture of being open and interact with the other, and at no point you want to say to the other, I don't want to hear you. That would be unacademic, to say to someone, I don't want to hear you anymore. However, interestingly, this luxury of being open to the other is itself based on shutting so many people. That is, especially we as in academics who work in the Western world, we have to question at what cost our wonderful liberal academic culture comes to existence. What makes us so wonderful, happy, and capable to be nice to each other? And what if this very capacity to be nice and open and willing to hear each other, etc., is based actually on a prior repression of other voices? What if the very condition of possibility of being an academic is an act of repression? And then you will have to say, well, actually, me saying that boycott is not academic culture, I'm sucking something fundamental in the whole history of colonialism and imperialism, something I will be talking about a bit more tomorrow, but I will, which is that capacity to hide the violent grounds on which your grooviness comes into existence. And in a sense, the politics of boycott becomes a politics of confronting that very condition of possibility. you say, when last year, the Israeli Anthropological Association invited me to give the keynote. And I was exactly, that was what brought it home. Because the people I was dealing with were my colleagues and shared my culture. They were really nice, really cosmopolitan, really kind of people with whom I can sit down and chat about what we did with the kids and where we went and everything's fine. And they were showing the culture of openness and we want you to challenge us and we want you to come to Israel, and I think Israeli anthropologists should be confronted by radical views. So the guy inviting me, the president of the Israeli Anthropological Association, was everything I wish a colleague to be. So it wasn't an issue of him looking, but then I thought, okay, so what is the meaning of me going and being my radical self in front of all these Israeli academics? What will be the outcome other than them coming out of the lecture and say, hey, we're so fantastic. We are actually capable of looking someone really radical in the face and listening and conversing in a really cosmopolitan way with them. And we've come out of it intact and concept we in Australia know really well, multiculturally enriched by the whole experience. And what happened to Palestinians? What happened to the Palestinian oppressive ground on which the possibility of this wonderful conversation, nothing would have happened. In fact, I would have reinforced the very grounds on which that wonderful conversation would have taken. And so the politics of boycott then is about academic culture, but not in the usual sense of the academic culture. It's more a politics which deals with the roots of academic culture, of whether we want to question the very basis of how nice we can be to each other.